Order, order. Jonathan Gullis to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 300399 relating to school attendance during Covid-19. I would like to thank Matthew Wardle, who began this petition and has gathered over 100,000 signatures, 136 from my constituency alone in Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork. I am thankful to have spoken to him today over the phone and hope to represent his views and those who have signed the petition's views in a very fair manner. I thought I would first start by briefly stating the law as it stands in relation to fines being used by schools and local authorities. Parents have a duty under Section 7 of the Education Act 1996 to ensure that their children of compulsory school age receive an efficient full-time education by attendance at school. Schools and local authorities can use a range of parental responsibility measures to provide support for school attendance with parents when their child's attendance at school becomes a problem. It is Section 23 of the Antisocial Behaviour Act 2003 that made provision for parents to be fined for their child's unauthorised absence from school. Since September 2013, the amount of time a parent must pay a fine was reduced. Parents must pay £60 within 21 days, and this will rise to £120 if paid within 22 to 29 days of the notice being issued. If the fine is not paid, the parent can be prosecuted. However, it is important to make clear there are various legal powers, as well as penalty notice or prosecutions, for schools and local authorities to implement if a child is missing school without a good reason. These include parenting orders, education supervision orders and school attendance orders. As parents, we all want our children in school. It is the best place for them to learn and socialise with their peers. Schools are vital to a child's well-being, safeguarding and education. Yet these are not normal times, and that means we cannot have schools operating in normal ways. However, we are in unprecedented times and therefore must act in this unprecedented way. So Matthew argues that the long-term effects of Covid-19 on children are still relatively unknown. The fact there was a huge pressure from parents back in April to keep their children at home, as well as the government sending the overwhelming majority of students home, illustrates the risk associated with sending them to school. Despite schools working tirelessly to be as Covid-secure as possible, that element of risk has not yet gone and is in fact heightened by the need for a second national lockdown over November. Matthew states that parents are responding to their protective instincts, that is driven by fear, and it is not fair to punish people acting in the best interest to safeguard their children, families and vulnerable children themselves. When the situation in August shows a reasonably stable R rate, it was understandable why the government thought school attendance rules should be restored in September. However, to Matthew and to those who signed the petition, this is thrown into doubt after the Prime Minister's talks of the rising risk of the NHS being overrun and cases spreading rapidly across the country. How is the situation today, Matthew asks, any different, if not worse, to that back in April of this year? Matthew asks also, can we not go back to virtual learning where teachers can upload pre-recorded lessons, schools can send learning packs out to homes as they did with their own children, or even fine parents who do not ensure that children complete a certain percentage of work provided? If none of these options are viable, then Matthew simply asks for parents to make a choice. Allow those parents who wish to conduct home learning the opportunity to do so without the need to deregister their child. In the first 8 weeks of returning to school this September, Matthew's children have had to spend 4 of those weeks in isolation at the school's request. This causes anxiety and stress in households, as well as difficulties with parents before Saturday's announcement, going back to offices and suddenly trying to arrange childcare where the tier system allowed. Amy McClellan, from the constituency of my honourable friends, the member for Stoke-on-Trent South, also wrote in to me to support Matthew. Amy argues that with airborne transmission, rather than fomites is the main way that Covid-19 has been spreading, then what is being done to improve poor ventilation in many schools, as is being tackled in Germany? And lastly, I spoke with James Bowen from the National Association of Head Teachers ahead of today's debate. The NAHT sees school fines being a blunt tool in abnormal times, creating an unnecessary conflict between the school and parents in a time when it is important we work together in order to beat coronavirus. A school taking such action is noted as always being the last resort, but parents who have children with underlying health conditions will rightly be anxious. Instead, he believes we should be helping schools to work with parents to reassure them of the safety measures taken and enable head teachers to act on a case-by-case basis when it comes to students not attending school. I asked the Minister to please give clear answers to Matthew and the hundreds of thousands of individuals who have signed this petition, so they know their voice has been heard and their concerns have been clearly considered. But before I sit down and enable others to speak, I would like to have on the record my personal position on this debate. I have informed Matthew that I disagree with the call for fines for low attendance to be once again suspended, and will briefly state why. I have contacted several primary and secondary schools across Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork to hear from head teachers, senior leaders and school attendance officers' perspectives. I also bring to the debate my 8 years of experience as a teacher in state secondary schools, a large amount of which I worked as a head of year, where I held the responsibility of overseeing attendance. The key points as to why we must keep the ability for schools and local authorities to fine non-attendance is summed up well by colleagues from the Excel Academy. Covid-related absence is discounted from a child's attendance, so it would never be the reason for a fine or court action. Students which schools have concerns over, based on attendance data from previous years, need to be aware of the consequences of not working with the school to see their child's attendance above at a minimum of 90%. And there are many support steps, as previously stated at the start of the speech, before a parent is fined. And lastly, schools would have no strategies left after all support is put in place, and potentially will not see an improvement of a pupil's attendance, meaning the suspension of the fine further makes it harder for schools to engage with those hard-to-reach families. In some extreme cases, one of my local schools reported having parents booking holidays to countries, knowing that would result in them having to quarantine, because holiday prices have been cheap and the law places an expectation on schools to provide home education while students quarantine and self-isolate. We need to remember that the decision to fine a parent is the decision for schools and local authorities. The Department for Education advised schools in the reopening guidance to take a supportive approach rather than being too hasty in issuing fines. The Department for Education has also asked schools and local authorities to communicate clear and consistent expectations around school attendance. Pupils and families should be identified if there is a possibility of them being reluctant and develop plans to re-engage with them. Schools can also use the additional catch-up funding and pupil premium funding to put measures in place for those families who require additional support to secure pupils' regular attendance. To add to this, there is the statement from the UK Chief Medical Officers on schools and childcare reopening back in August of this year. All signatories restate the importance attendance has for children and young people. The percentage of symptomatic cases requiring hospitalisation is estimated to be 0.1% for those children aged 0 to 9 and 0.3% among those aged 10 to 19. The statement also says, based on ONS data, teaching is a lower risk profession with international data to support this. This can also be supported by the House of Commons Library briefing, which shows that as of the 22nd of October 2020, whilst over 500,000 pupils did not attend school for Covid-19 related reasons, 0.1% had confirmed cases of coronavirus and 0.4% had a suspected case of coronavirus, with 459,000 pupils self-isolating due to potential contact with a case of Covid. We cannot pretend that any school will ever be risk-free, but we have to look at the data and accept that the damage to a child's life chances, health, both physically and mentally, as well as potential safeguarding concerns, means that the risk of schools being open to all pupils outweighs the risk of an outbreak of Covid. These are not easy choices, nor comfortable ones, but to see places like Stoke-on-Trent, Kidsgrove and Tork have young people be lifted out of the bottom 20% nationally for social mobility, to see us leave the bottom 20% nationally for level 3 and 4 qualification take-up, and to see those who are in work without any formal qualifications, which is 8% higher than national average, come down, then students need to be in the classroom with the expert in the room, their teacher, and ensure they can access one of the greatest equalisers we have across the country, school.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 300-399 relating to school attendance during the Covid-19 outbreak. Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Sir David. May I, from the start, make it clear that I believe in the importance of children attending school, that there is no other form of education that improves upon that, and that's for as long as we can keep schools safely open, it should be a priority to do so. But at the heart of today's debate must be the consideration of precisely what education a child is able to receive when they're at home. And so let us consider the reality when schools closed during the first lockdown, whilst around 30% of private schools pupils attended 4 or more online lessons per day, just 6.3% of state school pupils did the same. The backdrop here is crucial. Before lockdown, children on free school meals were leaving school on on average 18 months behind their classmates, and the gap was getting worse. But a quarter on free school meals did less than 1 hour's schoolwork a day during lockdown. While a staggering data from the Children's Commissioner indicates that over 58% of primary and just under half of secondary school pupils were provided no online lessons at all. They will have returned to school even further behind. And I don't know if members and right honourable members here read the Times today to find that the work of the Institute for Government suggested that Year 7 pupils, they found them to be 22 months behind where they should be, which is truly frightening. But this is not the fault of their schools and teachers working unbelievably hard under the most extraordinary of circumstances, because the barriers to remote education were exposed by the digital divide across our country. Here's the reality. 11% of the population are without home internet access, and an estimated 9% of children without access to a laptop, desktop or tablet. Ofcom estimates that the number to be up to an extraordinary 1.78 million children in the UK. So whilst the government promoted their investment in the online Oak Academy, let us be clear that no number of online lessons could benefit those children unable to log on from home. And for those with family members on pay-as-you-go contracts, it cost a staggering £37 a day to access that academy. Of course, none of this is new information to the Minister. Just before recess, he responded to my adjournment debate on the very issue. The debate was timely, just 36 hours before schools became legally responsible for providing online education for pupils self-isolating due to coronavirus. In the debate, the Minister celebrated the number of laptops and devices being distributed by the government. Warm words for the watching schools. And so you can imagine my disbelief when just 3 days after our debate, the government announced huge cuts to the remote education support that schools had been promised. Some will now receive just 20% of the laptops that they were expecting. The Minister must have known that the change was about to occur. So why did he not tell the House? Why did the department wait instead until Parliament had risen before they were staggeringly stepped through? I quote a furious teacher who contacted me after the announcement. How ironic that days after highlighting how schools have become so reluctantly used to last-minute guidance, that schools received this announcement at past 6 p.m. on the Friday we broke up for half-term. It would have been almost laughable if it hadn't become the grim reality. We feel totally let down and left behind. It seems to me that the Department for Education have given up. They were not ready and made the Plan Z decision to realise what they had at the time, a weak and poor offer to support the future generations of our country. And so I asked the Minister directly today, because unfortunately he hasn't yet responded to my letter after our debate. Which is it? Did he not know that the changes would be occurring, or did he deliberately not inform the House? This isn't just a point of principle. More school bubbles are self-isolating, more teachers are absent, and more pressure is being put on the government to close schools once again. And though I make clear once again that it's not a position that I support, the government must step in now to ensure that every child has the data and devices that they need if they are forced to learn from home. And importantly, a device is only as effective as the internet connection it's used with. No matter how expensive, how smart, how modern the device is distributed, it is educationally useless if it comes without the data or dongle needed in order to log in from home. Furthermore, being connected is one thing, but more than 880,000 children live in a house with only a mobile internet connection. I don't know about other members, but Mum's mobile doesn't strike me as an acceptable solution to logging in and learning from home. So I say to the Minister, who I consider to be a really principled person, who genuinely wants the best for our young people, please don't ignore the reality. We know that those children who are furthest behind are the least likely to have the tools at home that they need to remain connected. The impact for those children on the wrong side of the digital divide could be lifelong. With increasing numbers of pupils self-isolating, there is no longer a theoretical debate, but a practical problem for schools right now. Minister, none of us would have any pleasure pointing to today's debate as a warning that you did not heed. When compared to the billions of pounds being pledged by the government, I close by reiterating a comparatively cheap, tangible and quick solution to the problem that I have outlined. Give every child entitled to a free school meal access to the internet and an adequate device at home. Levelling up can no longer be warm words alone, because no matter our political view, we can surely all agree that no child's education should be dependent on their internet connection.
Hear, hear. Tom Hunt.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the third time. I think in the last week or two weeks, we weren't here last week. Week before, I served under your chairmanship twice. So I just wanted to make a few comments, obviously, from my position on both the Petitions Committee and the Education Select Committee, having looked at this issue very closely over the last however months since the start of the pandemic, and actually being quite depressed every week, seeing the immense damage done by school closures on really all of our pupils, but particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds and also those with special educational needs as well. I think in many senses, I remember when this petition was first discussed at the Petitions Committee, and I think in many senses it's a shame it couldn't have been debated far sooner. I think what it's calling for, was established in March, at a time when we really didn't know much about the virus and its impact on young people, whereas now we know far more. So I think it's whether everyone who signed a petition when they did would have signed it knowing what we know now, I honestly don't know. But I do disagree, though sympathising with the concerns of many of the people who would have signed that petition, I do disagree with its principal call, which is taking the power out of the hands of schools to issue fines if necessary, if parents decide to withhold their children from school. Ultimately, I think it is the role of those schools and the experts and the Department for Education to determine whether it is safe for children to go to school, not completely just the view of the parents. And I do feel that there are some unintended consequences of this. I'm of the view that virtually every parent whose kids are in school care passionately about their kids and their education. But I think, and we saw a very important decision that was made by the government at the start of the pandemic, was to keep schools open for children from vulnerable backgrounds. I think that was a very important decision that the government took. But what was concerning at the time was the small proportion of those who were deemed as vulnerable who actually went in. And I remember being on a session with the Children's Commissioner who had a real concern that actually, the brutal truth is the reason why some of those children are deemed as being vulnerable is because of the households they live in. And that is a sad reality. And the benefit of going to school every day is that other adults can check up on the welfare of that child day to day. And if there are any positions, any issues, any concerns, have a conversation with them and intervene. And it was a great concern for many of us that for a prolonged period of time, many of those vulnerable children weren't going into school. And I think that potentially putting the decision on whether they should go into school really entirely in the hands of a parent, I think on that occasion, I think perhaps it left me with some concern. So there's a question that we could have actually gone even further and said it was a requirement for all vulnerable children to come into school. In terms of the other, so I think in some respects that's to do with the unintended consequences of taking the power away from the school and the government also during that period of lockdown. But in terms of other concerns I have in terms of the online learning offer is, I was talking to a head teacher before this debate, I spoke to a head teacher from a school within my constituency, which is in a very deprived part of town, and it has probably the highest proportion of EAL students. And during that period, his estimate was, their online data indicates that only 22% of children from disadvantaged backgrounds who have another language other than English as their principal language actually received good quality online learning during the period that schools are closed. And that was only 10% a lot of children at the school come from a Roma community, and it was only 10% for them. So again, we've got to look at why that was. But I think going forward, we have to keep schools open. And I've, like many of my colleagues, would have received lots of emails recently from the National Education Union about their desire for schools to be closed now. I disagree with that, while sympathising with parents and teachers who have got concerns about safety, and the government needs to heed those concerns and address those concerns. I think it is absolutely critical that, come what may, our schools are kept open. We know far more now about the virus and the impact that it has on young people, but we also know far more now about what the impact of closing schools has on children, and particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I have to say that I am pleased that the opposition benches, and more the principal opposition, from what I've read over the last couple of days, are also of the view that schools must stay open. And I think it's incumbent on the government and the opposition to work together in whatever way they can to ensure that is the case. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, though sympathetic to some of the concerns raised in this petition, and completely understanding why at the time that petition was launched, as many people signed it as did, I think in the cold light of day today, I think that we must resist this and ensure that our schools have got the power. And I think that no head would take it lightly, issuing a fine. And I think they must do it sensitively when there are parents who have got serious concerns about Covid-19 and potential impact it may have. But ultimately, the school does need to have that power because I think we've seen the devastating impact that school closures have. We must keep them open. I also think the honourable member of Stoke-on-Trent North, who is whose view I share on this, as I've discussed it with him before, on the Education Committee, of which we both serve. Thank you very much.
West Street.
Thank you, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I begin by thanking the Petitions Committee for facilitating this debate, the organisers of the petition for presenting it to Parliament, and of course more than 100,000 people who've taken the time to engage with the petition, sign it and stimulate the discussion that we're having today, including 500 or so people in my own constituency. I think these debates are a really good way of providing a direct connection between salient issues which people are discussing in our constituencies and live debate here in Parliament. I also just want to take this opportunity, having only recently been appointed as the Shadow Schools Minister, just to say an enormous thank you to the entire schools community, the head teachers, governors, teachers and support staff who have been doing an outstanding job in very difficult circumstances. And I don't think any of us as constituency MPs could have been failed to be moved by some of the testimony we're hearing from schools about the extent to which they have moved heaven and earth to try and keep pupils learning, including during the first lockdown, where you could have been forgiven from some of the coverage for thinking that schools were closed and that learning had stopped. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Lots of staff were having to work doubly hard to make sure that their pupils could continue to gain access to learning in unusual circumstances through remote learning, and with all of the challenges which we know exist and which I will refer to, but have been outstandingly put, not just this afternoon, but in the adjournment debate before the recess by my honourable friend, the member for Mitcham and Morden. Obviously, a big part of this debate centres on fines, and I will turn to address that. But first and foremost, I just want to be absolutely clear about where we sit as the opposition, as the Labour Party, on this question of whether or not schools should remain open during the pandemic, which I think is really the thrust of the petitioner's case, and where we know from just some of the opinion polling out today, there is divided opinion in our country. We are absolutely clear that it is in the best interests of children and young people up and down the country for schools to remain open, for young people to continue accessing learning in school with a teacher for as much as they possibly can. There's a strong reason for that. First and foremost, the reason we invest in teachers and the reason why successive governments, but you'll forgive me for particularly referring to the actions of the last Labour government, invested so much into education, is that we know that of all of the policy levers that we can pull in Parliament and in government, education is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in terms of shaping young people's life chances and giving them every opportunity in life that they deserve. And we know that every single day of school missed for pupils from every background, actually, has a significant impact on their achievement, on their understanding, and crucially on their life chances. And for young people from the most disadvantaged background, that is especially true. So we have to do everything we can to make sure that throughout this pandemic, as the Children's Commissioner has strongly argued, that schools are among the last to close and the first to reopen. And I would appeal to parents who are minded to withdraw their children from school because of worries and concerns and anxieties about whether or not school is safe, whether or not it's the best place to be, that they have to think really carefully about their own children's long-term futures and their life chances, and with the best will in the world, and paying enormous tribute to the work that actually parents and carers have been doing at home to try and support their children through learning. That is no substitute whatsoever for a qualified teacher, a trained professional teaching children in the environment of the classroom. So we should be really, really clear about that. We should also be very concerned about the impact that the first lockdown, but also ongoing absences are having on children's life chances, especially those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. Analysis from the Education Endowment Foundation, which was published back in June, said its median estimate was that the attainment gap could widen by 36%, but that plausible estimates indicated it could widen by between 11% and 75% as a result of school closures caused by the coronavirus pandemic. In May, actually, Vicky Stewart, the Deputy Director of DFE's Pupil Premium and School Food Division, also pointed to very similar figures. Research published by the Royal Society in June suggests that the school time lost because of the pandemic could harm the economy for the next 65 years, and that unless catch-up lessons are effective, researchers predicted a 3% loss in future annual earnings for pupils caught up by the pandemic. And I refer to those figures in particular, not because I have a utilitarian view that the only reason that education matters is because of the long-term interest of the economy or people's earnings potential, but it's more to underline this point, which is that significant periods of time missed, and let's be clear, pupils have already missed significant time in school this year, has not just an impact on this academic year or the next round of examinations or the round of examinations beyond that. It has a long-term, lasting and detrimental impact on people's life chances and opportunities. So we can't be at all complacent about that. Analysis of government data by the FFT Education Data Lab found that pupils missing the most schooling are found in the poorest areas of the country. And this is compounded by the fact that online remote schooling has worked less well for poorer families. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. As my honourable friend for Mitcham and Morden outlined very powerfully before the recess, there is deeply unequal access to online learning at home. And it should come as no surprise to people that those from the poorest backgrounds don't necessarily have access to the devices they need, suitable devices, but they also lack even the broadband internet access that many people can just take for granted. And when you look at the pay-as-you-go charging rates and those stark figures of how much it would cost to access Oak National Academy or BBC Bitesize, it's really quite staggering. Now, I agree with my honourable friend, the member for Mitcham and Morden, that government should ensure that no pupil forced to isolate at home is doing so without access to the IT and the internet access that they need. But I would also call on internet service providers to play their part too, because there is more that they could do. It is within their gift, for example, to make sure that certain websites like Oak National Academy or BBC Bitesize, which are there for legitimate online learning purposes, should be made free to access and shouldn't count towards people's data limits. I think that would be a really good way for the big internet service providers and telecoms companies to step up to the plate. I'll certainly give way.
I just want to know if you want to remember going forward, if there are going to be any future closures going to school, or if there's any kind of rota system that children have to self-isolate. I just want to know if going forward you think Ofsted should have a role when it looks at schools and inspects schools at the job the school in question has done to make sure it facilitates first-class online learning if there are a significant number of kids in that school who have to self-isolate.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I do think that there is a role for Ofsted to play in looking at distance or remote learning in the home, and not least to disseminate and share best practice amongst schools. Let's just be clear for a moment. We are asking schools across the country to do something which they haven't previously been asked to do. And the very best teachers will have to adapt quite significantly to teaching remotely. It is a completely different skill set. And I think we actually do an enormous disservice to people whose professional careers are spent in distance learning by pretending that teaching in front of a classroom full of pupils where you can look into the whites of their eyes right in front of you, you can make sure they've got access to the right books and kit that they need for their learning. It's very, very different challenge to teaching someone through an internet connection over video streaming. I'll certainly give way.
We know that only 6.3% of pupils have access to 4 or more online lessons a day during lockdown. And within that, there is a huge, broad range. I would particularly like to commend to the Minister the work of the Ursuline Convent in Merton, the girls' Catholic school, where they were given 6 lessons a day online. Every girl was given her own tablet, and they had safety systems, because safety is important in this, where they knew whether the girl had signed on at 9 o'clock in the morning. They phoned the parents if they hadn't, and if they accessed a site that they would rather they hadn't, they also contacted parents. So there's a vast range out there, but most schools are really trying to play catch-up.
I've strongly endorsed that point made by my honourable friend. I think that's absolutely right. I'm also very concerned, coming back to the research that we already have available to us, about the large gap emerging in learning hours between those from the most affluent backgrounds and those from the poorest backgrounds, because it is stark. It's more than an hour a day for both primary and secondary pupils, but when you look at the breakdown of data between the poorest and the wealthiest backgrounds, pupils are learning significantly less if they're from a poorer background as opposed to a more affluent background, and that raises really serious long-term challenges for closing the attainment gap. I'll give way.
A full house now of those who are making intervention. I mean, I wrote a piece in the Times Red Box where I raised some of the concerns. 27% of those in lower income households do not use the internet, which is a really startling figure. And I'm very proud to be a member of the blue-collar Conservative group that has joined up with Labour colleagues asking for a digital catch-up scheme. And I would just like to hear the Shadow Minister's thoughts on that, and obviously privately urge the Minister himself to take that away as something to look at and see how we can really bring that forward. Because when I listen to schools like St Bart's Academy Trust that have 19 schools across North Staffordshire and South East Cheshire, and they were promised 465 laptops, but yet have only been given 55, that is a great concern to many disadvantaged pupils in their trust schools.
That's absolutely right, and we've heard from the chair of the Education Select Committee that there are around back in June, 700,000 disadvantaged children were not doing homework and didn't have proper access to computers or the internet. As my honourable friend has indicated, that number could be higher. And look, this brings me to some of the sort of fundamental concerns I have about where the government have been on education throughout this pandemic. I really do think that on too many occasions, education has been an afterthought for the government in terms of its response to the pandemic. I think more thought and more guidance was provided to opening pubs than were provided to opening schools. I think some of the support that's been provided to schools in terms of the funding they need to keep a safe environment, PPE, sanitisers, hand-washing facilities, deep cleans, frequency of cleans, staff cover for absences where staff have been forced to self-isolate. It really falls short of what schools need. And Head teachers are, and this is my point of reassurance to the public and people who are thinking about whether to send their children to schools, head teachers are doing everything they can to keep their schools safe. And I don't know a single head teacher who would open their school if they didn't believe it was safe. But they are looking towards the end of this financial year with real worry and anxiety, because they will spend what it takes to keep their schools safe for their pupils and their staff. But at the moment, they don't have the certainty to know that as that financial year end looms and approaches, that government will step up to do whatever it takes to make sure those costs are covered. I think government needs to act in that respect. I am deeply concerned by what we saw before the half-term, with allocations of laptops being cut at the 11th hour and at short notice. I think government really needs to step up here and actually recognise, and I think this is a general point about the pandemic response, there are some things that central government can do well. I think providing very responsive emergency resources to local communities, whether food parcels or laptops and internet connections, it's much better done locally. So give local authorities and academy trusts and schools the freedom and the resources to buy the kit that they need for their pupils, because they know them best, but they just need to know they've got the money to make sure that those kids can get access to the kit and the internet access that they need. And I'd really urge the Minister to reflect on the shortcomings of the provision that we've had so far. I'd also like to turn to the issue of fines, because I think as a general point, and we heard this sort of set out earlier in the debate, I do think that fines are a blunt instrument when it comes to compelling people to turn up for schools. The General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, Jeff Barton, says, and I quote, "We don't think it is the right approach to fine parents for the non-attendance of children as soon as schools fully reopen in September, and the government should not expect schools to take this action." We've had similar representations from the NEU and the National Association of Head Teachers too. But we see too many cases where, as much as government says, look, this is, let's have a conversation first, this is about discretion, we have seen too many cases where this doesn't always apply, and where actually schools don't necessarily believe they have the flexibility that governments say they do. So one of my own constituents, a teenage girl who was shot in the lungs when she was a young child, she was compelled by her school to go back, despite the risk of coronavirus, and a letter from her GP, because the school had threatened them with a fine. A mother of a terminally ill 3-year-old was forced to deregister her older daughter from her school to avoid being charged weekly non-attendance fines. A mother with type 1 diabetes, asthma and an underactive thyroid, which classes her as clinically vulnerable under NHS guidelines, has been threatened with a 3-month prison sentence and a £2,500 fine because she refused to send her children back to school amid coronavirus. I just think some of this stuff is just bizarre and really inappropriate to put families in this position. I don't think school fines work as a general point of principle. I do think in these current circumstances, government has got to be clearer in its guidance about circumstances in which there are vulnerable family members at home with underlying health conditions where they're concerned that the child coming back from school might present a risk, or indeed if they live with someone who is a member of staff in schools and they're coming to present a risk. And I know that's something that lots of staff in schools and school leaders are anxious about. I'll certainly give way.
Thank you very much for giving way. I mean, those are very powerful stories, and I have huge sympathy for those involved. But does my honourable member agree with me, though, that there could be other stories where, by not giving the school that discretion, there could actually be an example where you've got some vulnerable kids who actually, by going back to school, is the best thing for them and enables some more oversight? There might actually be cases where if schools didn't have that fine, it could lead to detriment to those vulnerable kids.
Well, ultimately, in the worst case, parents have the right to withdraw their children from education altogether. And I think, by the way, that is not the right course of action, and all of the evidence says that children will be safer, happier and better educated if they're in school. And that's why we are being so clear about the fact that the government has to do whatever it takes to keep schools open. We don't hear the phrase, whatever it takes, so often these days. But there are legitimate concerns that people have. There are assurances that people need, whether they're parents sending their children to school or staff going to work in school. There are assurances they need, which is to know that the head teacher of that school and the governing body are being given the resources they need to make sure the school is clean, safe and welcoming, that have all of the right measures in place, from protective equipment to hand washing facilities and sanitisers, to make sure that they're not having to cut corners on cleaning because the resources are there, accounting for the fact that in catering facilities, for example, there are often multiple cleaning rounds needed throughout the day. They need to know that if, for whatever reason, staff can't be at school themselves because they're forced to isolate, that they can bring in the cover support that they need to make sure that their children are still being well supported and well educated. They need to know that if their children can't attend school because they're required to self-isolate, that they're going to be able to learn at home and that catch-up support will be provided. And again, I'm really concerned about the fact that with the schemes that the government have already announced, well, obviously they're not up and running yet, though out to tender. I'm not convinced that those funding initiatives are targeted as well as they should be on pupils from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And I would urge the government to get back to its focus. I'm really looking forward to the exchanges that I'll no doubt have over many occasions in the coming weeks, months and years with the Minister. I do think one of the fundamental problems with the government's approach to education policy in the last 10 years and where we are today is that the attainment gap at crucial points in people's education journey, whether their entry to primary school at the age of 5, leaving primary school at the age of 11, sitting their GCSEs at the age of 16, that progress to close the attainment gap hasn't just stalled, it's beginning to slip into reverse gear. And if we're not careful, we will allow this pandemic to rewrite the story of educational disadvantage in this country in a way that none of us wants to see, where the gap between those from the wealthiest and the poorest backgrounds widens, where those children who have special educational needs and require additional support are left further behind. And we cannot let that happen, because even with the best lifelong learning system in the world, children only get one chance at a primary education and a secondary education, and these are formative years. They are absolutely crucial, and that's why we believe that schools must be open, they must be supported to be safe and open, and we need to make sure that we have an approach, a national strategy to make sure that no pupil is left behind. Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship again. I haven't kept count like my honourable friend, but I'm sure it's many on many occasions. And can I also welcome the honourable member for Ilford North to his position, and I look forward to debating with him. And if today is an example of those exchanges that we're going to have in the future, I am looking forward to it very much indeed. And can I congratulate my honourable friend for the excellent and fair way that he introduced this debate. Just to pick up on one or two points made by the honourable member for Ilford North on attainment gap, the whole raison d'etre of education policy since 2010 has been to close that attainment gap. That has been the reason for all our reforms in reading, in maths, in the curriculum, in the GCSEs, in A-levels, in the academies programme, in the school improvement programme. Everything we have been doing since 2010 has been about closing that attainment gap, making sure that those from the least advantaged background in our country have the same quality of education as their more advantaged peers. And we have managed to close the gap, the attainment gap in primary school by 13% since 2011 and by 9% in secondary schools. And we do worry about the effect of the pandemic on that success, which is why we have managed to secure £1 billion of catch-up funding and £350 million of that is specifically targeted at the most disadvantaged pupils through the National Tutoring Programme. Sir David, this debate is particularly timely in the light of the Prime Minister's announcement this weekend of new national restrictions. We are clear that the government will continue to prioritise the long-term future of young people and will not be asking schools to close. It is vital that as many children as possible attend school for their education, for their well-being and for their wider development, a point shared by my honourable friend for Ipswich and indeed by the honourable member for Ilford North and indeed the honourable member for Mitcham and Morden and my honourable friend for Stoke North. High levels of pupil attendance in school over this period are critical, both to ensure that this generation of children reach their potential and to prevent a widening of that attainment gap. Now, I'd like to begin by paying tribute as well to the outstanding efforts of teachers, staff and parents across the country that mean that pupils are continuing to receive the education and opportunities they deserve in the face of this pandemic. And I'd also like to extend my thanks specifically to the attendance workers in schools and local authorities for their continued hard work to support so many pupils to attend. Now, at the beginning of the outbreak, we made the difficult decision to limit the number of pupils attending school. We empowered schools and local professionals to prioritise vulnerable children and young people and the children of critical workers for attendance. And although rates of coronavirus are rising, it is vital that children attend school to minimise, as far as possible, the long-term impact of the pandemic on their education. And we are clear that school attendance is mandatory and all the usual rules apply. And these include a parent's duty to secure their child's regular attendance at school and the ability for schools and local authorities to issue sanctions and to secure attendance. Now, the Department will be shortly issuing a summary guidance to schools setting out the implications of the new national restrictions. There is a clear correlation, as the Honourable Member has said, between time absent from school and attainment, and pupils with higher overall absence tend to do less well in their GCSEs. Now, figures show that on the 22nd of October, as of that date, Sir David, 99.3% of schools were open, excluding schools on half-term or inset days, and up to 7 million children and young people were in school, representing 86% of pupils across the country. Now, we continue to regularly collect and monitor school attendance data, which is published on a weekly basis as part of the Department's commitment to transparency and to support local action. To support high levels of attendance, we have specifically asked schools to continue to communicate clear and consistent expectations about school attendance to pupils and their families. We've asked schools to identify pupils who are reluctant to attend or who are at risk of disengagement and develop plans to re-engage them using the catch-up funding that they'll receive. We've asked schools to work closely with other professionals, including social workers and specialist services, to support pupils' attendance. And there are examples of excellent work to support high levels of attendance across the country, including in my honourable friend's constituency. The Stoke-on-Trent Opportunity Area is funding a project to tackle the underlying causes of unauthorised absence by creating a behaviour and attendance leaders network to establish consistent approaches and share best practice across all the schools of the city. Now, underpinning all this important work by schools are the usual school attendance rules and legal duties. And these rules and duties will continue to apply during the forthcoming period of new national restrictions. Parents have a duty under Section 7 of the Education Act 1996 to ensure that if their child is of compulsory school age, they receive an efficient, full-time education, either by attendance at school or otherwise. And schools and local authorities have a range of measures to use if a child's attendance at school becomes a problem. And the law gives schools and local authorities power to offer parenting contracts and obtain parenting orders to improve school attendance. And prosecution of a parent is available to local authorities, but as a last resort under Section 444 of the Education Act 1996, where a parent has failed to secure their child's regular school attendance. Of course, when considering the appropriate action to tackle absence, we trust schools and local authorities, now more than ever, to consider the individual circumstances of each pupil and family and take the best course of action to support the child's attendance at school, including the use of these powers where appropriate, and to do so sensitively, as pointed out by my honourable friend, the member for Ipswich. Now, we also encourage parents to work with their child's school and the local authority to discuss the reasons behind their child's absence and together agree an action plan so that the right support can be put in place to help the child return to regular and consistent education. And where children are not able to attend because they are following public or clinical health advice related to coronavirus, parents will not be penalised. And we'll shortly be publishing our updated guidance setting out current attendance expectations for children who are clinically extremely vulnerable. And we also recognise that some pupils, Sir David, or families may still be anxious about sending their child to school, especially in the light of the rise in infections. We know schools have been discussing the concerns with these families in order to provide reassurance. Now, to increase support further in the long term, we also remain committed to tackling the issues of mental health problems and to implementing our joint green paper that helps to introduce new mental health support teams linked to schools and colleges to help schools deal with mental health issues that are now as prevalent, if not more prevalent, than they have been in recent years. So, David, the safety of all children in schools is also especially important at the present time, and we have set out a clear framework for school leaders to put in place protective measures for pupils and their staff, protective controls, including ensuring that people who have symptoms do not attend school, that robust hand and respiratory hygiene measures are followed, that cleaning arrangements are enhanced, that contact is minimised between individuals, and that schools actively engage with the NHS test and trace. The UK Chief Medical Officers, all 4 of them, have been clear that the risk to children of becoming severely ill from coronavirus is low, and therefore for the vast majority of children, the benefits of being back in the classroom far outweigh these risks. Nevertheless, access to testing is available for any child or young person or member of staff displaying symptoms, as well as any symptomatic members of their household. And supplies of test kits have also been provided to all schools for those who develop symptoms on-site and face significant personal barriers to accessing a test. Now, the Honourable Member for Mitcham and Morden raised the important issue of remote education, and as she did in the adjournment debate just before recess, and I share her passion, her genuine passion, I have to say, in ensuring that all children have access to remote education. We are also clear that for some pupils who are unable to attend school in person, remote education may need to be an essential component of their education alongside classroom teaching. And in these circumstances, the government wants to ensure that there is no doubt about the roles and responsibilities within the system for providing remote education. And the Secretary of State therefore made a temporary continuity direction on the 1st of October to clarify that schools have a duty to provide remote education for state-funded, school-aged children who are unable to attend school due to coronavirus, in line with our guidance and the law. Now, to support schools and colleges in meeting those expectations, the Department announced a further remote education support package, which includes access to the right technology to deliver remote education, peer-to-peer training on how to use this effectively, and practical tools, guidance and webinars. And alongside this, the Department has made £4.84 million available for Oak National Academy, both for the summer term of the last academic year and then for the 2020-21 academic year, to provide video lessons for a broad range of subjects from reception up to year 11. Now, the Honourable Lady also talked about devices. The government is doing everything it can to support schools to deliver remote education. As part of over £195 million invested to support remote education, the Department delivered over 220,000 laptops and tablets for disadvantaged children who would not otherwise have access to a digital device, and we're adding to the support by making 340,000 additional laptops and tablets available to support children who might face disruptions to their education this term. And since September, since the beginning of term, over 100,000 of these laptops have already been delivered to schools. And in the context, Sir David, of increasing global demand, we are bringing schools' device allocations more closely in line with average size of a pupil group that is self-isolating. And we recognise that levels of self-isolation may be higher in different areas of the country, and that face-to-face education is being prioritised in all eventualities. The more targeted... Let me wait to my honourable friend.
Jonathan Gullis.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I have heard what he said regarding the allocation based on isolation needs. I suppose where I represent in Stoke-on-Trent and surrounding North Staffordshire, and I'm sure honourable members, the honourable member for Mitcham Morden was sort of getting at, if we look at it at deprivation levels, that's where actually the need would be higher in somewhere, so like say Stoke-on-Trent, compared to maybe somewhere like Kidsgrove, which I also represent, which is maybe statistically a more affluent place. I haven't got those figures to hand, but I'm sort of being semantic with that. But I think that's where I would like to see it, is looking at the idea of deprivation more over than just looking simply at the cohort sizes.
Yes, Honourable Friend makes a very good point, and we recognise that there will be different levels of self-isolation as well as different areas of need in different parts of the country. But I'll just finish this point and I will come to the Honourable Lady. So this more targeted design will mean that as many schools and disadvantaged children as possible benefit from receiving a device in the event that their face-to-face education is disrupted.
If I remember the figures correctly, households with an income of less than £10,000, only 10% of them have internet access at home, while those households with an income above £40,000, access to the internet at home stands at 90-something%. So, deprivation is the key.
Yes, the Honourable Member makes a very good point, as is my Honourable Friend. That's why a targeted approach is important. And she raised the point about why wasn't this mentioned during the debate. Well, at the time of that debate, no decision had been made about changes to the allocation of laptops and tablets. So, David, in conclusion, I'm grateful to my Honourable Friend in starting this debate. Securing a high level of attendance for all children remains an absolute priority for this government. We have put in place a range of supportive measures to support good school attendance, even in these challenging circumstances. It is right that schools and local authorities have all the necessary tools to secure excellent attendance, which includes measures to support families, but also sanctions where these are necessary. And where children are not able to attend school, as they're following clinical or public health advice related to coronavirus, we have been clear that absence will not be penalised. And given the profoundly positive impact that being in school can have on a child's attainment and life chances, high levels of attendance in school have never been more important.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much to David, and I would like to thank the Minister and the Shadow Minister for their responses to the petitioners, and for all members, for the Honourable Member for Mitcham-Moreland, my Honourable Friend, the Member for Ipswich, for taking part in what I think is a really important debate. And I think it was really nice to see how the debate looked, as well as the wider role of schools. And I absolutely want to add on to the record, as the Minister did and as the Shadow Minister for School Standards did, my incredible thanks to teachers, support staff, local authority staff working with schools as well for the above and beyond work. I think that they are true unsung heroes in the education profession regarding COVID, and I do think there has been a very lazy, stereotypical sort of response from a minority in our community who have said that somehow teachers were on some sort of 6-month holiday, which couldn't be any further from the truth. I have a partner who is head of RE, and I saw her spend her 8.5 hours on just ranking kids in order for the GCSE and A-level algorithm, although I'm sure the Minister will be happy for me to pass on from that topic as quickly as possible. I want to just quickly say from the Honourable Lady from Mitcham and Morden that the digital divide is a huge issue. It's something I passionately believe that there's an issue that needs tackling. I would love to work with her more closely outside this House to see how we can tackle that. As I raised, and as she has raised, that we need to look at deprivation when it comes to the supplying of technology. I have also personally written to the Chancellor about the idea of broadband being part of an essential item for a household, therefore bring the VAT down to 5% like it is for gas, water and electric, which I appreciate would cost £2 billion to the Exchequer, but obviously I also think is a really important measure. Absolutely, indeed.
Getting involved in this issue makes me aware that poorer people access the internet differently, just like they access electricity, gas and other essential things. So, the main internet companies are great, but most people in poor situations pay as you go. It's some of the companies that we don't necessarily use. So unless we address how people access those services, we won't understand or tackle the issue.
I completely agree with the Honourable Lady, and I think if we're going to, and I say this is an idea that I've worked with a local IT company on, but of course is not necessarily the solution to the long-term problem. And in Stoke-on-Trent, we're very lucky to have be a gigabit city. I've got 104 kilometres installed around a full fibre network. But now the challenge is, as we install that into homes, how do we ensure that is affordable and accessible to some of the, let's be quite frank, in some areas I represent, the bottom 20% for social mobility, some of the most deprived communities in the country where, on average, they earn £100 less than an average earner for a full-time job per annum. £100 per week less than a full-time worker than other parts of the United Kingdom. So absolutely, we have to understand how technology is being accessed, and I completely agree with the Honourable Lady when, I think it may have been the Shadow Minister, apologies for who I've forgotten of, but when they talked about mum's mobile not being the best tool in the house, and I've worked with many students in my time who, sadly, that was the only way in which work could be done. So I look forward to working with members from across the House to look at the digital divide, and I think the highlight of the Oak Academy is an absolute triumph. I'd like to thank the Minister for his incredible hard work in getting that set up. I know he's engaged with a wide range of professionals who have done some incredible work. I don't think any member in this House thinks that that's not a triumph. It's just about making sure that as many kids who are unable to be in the classroom can access this really important tool, which I hope can be looked at keeping well beyond. I think it would be a really positive tool to have all year round for all students of all future generations. I want to also thank my honourable friend from Ipswich. Yes, we were indeed on the Education Select Committee with the Children's Commissioner, who I think is an absolute tour de force. I have a huge amount of time for her. Although we may have disagreed on other issues recently, I certainly have her full support that school absolutely should be the last place to close and absolutely be the first to reopen. I'm really grateful from the honourable member for Ilford North for stating the opposition's view that schools must stay open. I really am going to say this to members of the National Education Union, the leaders of that union, that whilst before I've been ranty and shouty at them in the Select Committee, I'm not going to be like that now. I'm asking them to end this call for a school to close, because I really think that is a divisive campaign that's not going to bring schools and families together, nor is it going to help us as politicians who are making incredibly challenging and difficult decisions closer together with the public. And so I ask them to cease on that campaign, actually work with the government and the Shadow Minister so that we can find ways of how schools can get the most support they can do. And I do want to put on record the Shadow Minister's viewpoint about the funding for additional cleaning measures and PPE, because especially now we're entering deeper restrictions, there is going to be increased anxiety. Staff are going to want additional support, and I do think that we have to have a look at that. I'm not asking for extortionate amounts of money, nor I think the schools are asking for loads of PPE that is needed in hospitals or care homes, but I just think any additional support would be very welcome in what is going to be a very, I think, dark and bleak winter ahead. I also want to place on record again to the Minister, thank you very much again for the £1 billion for catch-up funding. I think, again, that's welcome. I do have some reserves, because I'm a bit of a sceptic, about the £350 million for the National Tutoring Programme, because I want to ensure that ends up helping the kids that need it most. I've seen lots of money given to lots of big organisations, and yet when I speak to people in Stoke-on-Trent, they've never met these organisations on the street. So absolutely the right way to channel the money, absolutely the right thing to do, but please let's make sure they actually deliver in the areas where there is the greatest need. I think that schools have done a remarkable job. 99.3% of schools being open is an incredible achievement in this time. I think we all recognise that. I'm very grateful for the Minister promoting the Stoke Opportunity Area, which is in its second year, and will be going for a third year. And I'm sure the Minister will be looking favourably upon that as we continue to see delivery in Stoke-on-Trent of improvements. And if I go back to the premise, which is obviously according to the fine, and Matthew, I would like to think, has heard a conciliatory tone from both sides of this chamber, has heard the reasons why we believe schools should be open, but also fully stating that we understand the anxieties that parents have. We want to work with those parents to ensure that they feel schools are the safest place, because, as we know, school is the best place for a child to learn and give them the best opportunity in life ahead. So I hope Matthew feels that whilst we may not be fully signed up to his hopes of this being suspended, that we are going to work very closely with schools to see them be as safe and secure as possible and ensure that future generations get the very best opportunity and which school is, as I said earlier, also the greatest equaliser in our society.
The question is that this House has considered Petition 300399 relating to school attendance during the Covid-19 outbreak. As many as have that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no, I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. Colleagues, just before you go...